Welcome to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. You know, apparently it takes 1.39 liters of water to make a liter of water. That's right. The liter of water that you purchase down there at the shop, it requires 1.39 liters of water in the whole process of getting the water, manufacturing the water, distributing the water, consuming the water to get that 1 liter of water. It's called the economics of suicide. Yes, humans are frickin' stupid. But even that's not as idiotic as when we try to create 1 unit of GDP growth. Get this. Since the collapse of Lehman Brothers, some estimate that it has taken $18 of debt to create $1 of GDP growth. It's called stall speed. Mayday, 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 the sucker's going down. Stacy?
Max, the first article here that we're going to discuss shows you in chart form this stall speed of which you speak. Paul Brodsky, the Fed is holding a burning match. The burning match can be seen in these two charts. First up, the orange line there is total U.S. credit. Since 1983, you can see that it's divorced from the blue line, which is nominal GDP, and the gray line at the bottom is base money supply. So either one of those two has to increase, either the nominal GDP or the base money supply, in order to collateralize that orange line of debt going up. The second is total U.S. credit to U.S. nominal GDP, and that puts all those charts for the first one into one chart, and you can see the stall speed. So we've hit a point where no debt is not creating anything.
Yeah, this is really the amazing charts here that clearly demonstrate this economic problem, is that no matter how much largesse is given to these banks in the form of free money from the central banks, they are unable to lend it out into the economy in sufficient quantities to generate any GDP growth. And that number's always been a bit skewed since the world went off a gold standard and onto a fiat currency standard since 1971. But going back to 1971, so you needed at that time about $1 to $2 of debt to create $1 of GDP growth. Then right before the crisis of 2008, it required $7 of debt to create $1 of GDP growth. Then the reaction to the crisis in 2008 was to flood the world with debt, and they flooded the world with $18 worth of debt per $1 of GDP growth, which is to say that they don't get any GDP growth at all, really, but they just keep flooding the system with debt, and that debt is suppressing GDP growth. The money creation, as I've said on this show many times before, the money printing is creating a net effect of deflation. That's what GDP collapse is all about. Sure, some prices are going up, but not as fast as the implosion of the banks, the shadow banks, the zombie banks are causing this stall speed, as you point out, stall speed, and when they hit stall speed, you're up there at 30,000 feet or what have you, and then boom, it's down to gravity, takes effect.
What do you do when you hit stall speed if you're the head of an empire or the head of the central bank of the United States, the Federal Reserve Bank? What do? Well, if you can't grow the economy, on principle, they're against that anyway, right? They're against people having any sort of wealth of their own. So they've got to steal it, don't they? Because the fundamental disconnect today is unnatural clearing levels, prices of goods, services, and assets that do not reflect society's sustainable needs, wants, and preferences. So over time, the natural cycle of an economy is that prices will decline. But in a finance-based economy, central banks and heads of state don't like that. They want always inflation. So you see global monetary authorities have sought price stability, which in practice implies the need for constant price inflation to offset what would otherwise be naturally occurring price deflation. Indeed, price stability has become a bipartisan, socially acceptable euphemism for consistent policy-administered credit and price inflation, functionally the diminution of a currency's purchasing power. And they provide a chart for this. This is CPI from 1910 to the present. And as you can see, it's been declining and down 59%, Max, since 1983.
Right. We bring up a couple of different things there. Deflation in this context is debt deflation. The idea that the government can print money to create inflation is an attempt to try to inflate debt away. That's their intention. But that's not happening. In fact, it's exacerbating the debt accumulation. The more money they print, they're not getting the inflation that they hoped they would get that would diminish the debt. Actually, they're increasing the debt load. The debt load is going higher, both in nominal and in real terms, because GDP, as we're pointing out, is also shrinking. So debt as a percentage of GDP is going higher. Debt in nominal terms is going higher. Debt is just keep going higher and higher, and you've hit the stall speed. There's no policies, what we're saying here. There's no policy. There's no monetary policy. There's no fiscal policy that can be implemented that can rectify this fact that the engines on the plane at 30,000 feet have stalled, and now we're getting ready for heading down into a crash landing. Nothing can stop the crash landing. I mean, Mark Carney says he's going to take the Bank of England's balance sheet from 4 trillion pounds to 9 trillion pounds in an attempt to keep the plane that has no engines running at this point in the air for a little while longer. That may work for another few months, but ultimately, within the next 12 months, it's going to crash.
Well, I mean, the CPI chart shows that this is a form of theft as well. By the way, inflation is a form of theft from the people. Remember, I said this is when they've hit stall speed, what do they have to do? They have to steal it. So as they point out here, the rate of currency dilution has exceeded the rate of production growth. So by every single trick, every single idea they could come up with, they're losing, they're falling further behind. Now, regarding this stealing from work and labor and savings, The Economist points out labor pains. All around the world, labor is losing out to capital. And you see a chart here. This is labor costs as percentage of nominal GDP. The line at the bottom there is Mexico, and they've lost the most. A falling labor share implies that productivity gains no longer translate into broad rises in pay. Instead, an ever larger share of the benefits of growth accrues to owners of capital.
Look, the amount of money being created does have an effect on CPI, or what people associate inflation being, the consumer price indexes. And over the past 40 years, you have situations where the CPI is running at a rate that's higher than the rate of debt accumulation. But over the past 5 or 6 years, you only have had one statistic, and that is that debt is growing faster than either CPI or GDP or wage inflation. There's only one thing growing, and that is debt. And this is rare throughout the history of America and the United Kingdom. Very rarely, I would say probably never, in the history of these two countries have you had a straight 7 years now of debt and money printing accumulation that hasn't generated any uptick in GDP at all. And remember, when the UK and the US say that their GDP is positive, it's because they're understating that inflation number. If they use the actual inflation number of stuff that people actually buy day to day, food and energy, it would be negative right now. Well,
they're counting the increase in debt. They're just counting debt as GDP at this point. And from that first chart I showed you, you saw that the debt credit is rising, but it's doing nothing at all to nominal GDP. It's doing nothing.
I want to just recap this for a second. What we're saying here is that this is a rare situation in the U.S. economy, and it's being replicated around the world, that the debt is skyrocketing and it's not having any effect whatsoever on GDP or inflation or wages. There have been times in the past under a theory, let's say Keynesian theory. Let's say Paul Krugman, for example. Paul Krugman in the New York Times believed 5 years ago that if you simply doubled or tripled or quadrupled the debt in America, you'd get some GDP growth. He's been discredited. He's been proven wrong. He's been proven a charlatan. Whereas guys who don't follow that particular school of thought have been proven correct.
Well, that's the article in The Economist about labor not increasing their wages is pointing out that productivity gains have been huge in the time that their actual share of it has declined. It's a neo-feudal sort of system.
Well, I'll give you an example of great productivity gain. Paying prisoners $1 a day to do 8 or 10 or 12 hours of work per day. They're the most productive workers in America, are the prison population. And the policymakers in Washington want to turn the whole population into a prison population. And then they can say, look, they're so productive. We only pay them $1 a day. And look at all these license plates that they get to stamp. They're the most, they're telemarketing and getting people to buy, lotto tickets and go to the casinos and blow their wad of cash. They're so productive.
Well, let's go back to how the Fed and the banking system, the finance system, has to steal in order to sustain the Ponzi scheme left. And part of the NSA scandal, I think, is, by the way, about that, mostly about that, is about them stealing corporate secrets from everybody else in the world. But let's look at a story here. Cartel traders advised banks. 3 currency dealers linked to a global investigation into alleged rigging of foreign exchange markets advised the Bank of England on the fallout from the Eurozone crisis. Max, so these are the bankers' names. Rohan Ramchandani, a Citigroup trader, Richard Usher, a JP Morgan executive, and Neil O'Riordan of UBS are all members of an influential committee appointed by the bank to provide intelligence on the currency markets. And they've been implicated now in rigging global Forex markets, a $5.3 trillion per day market.
Right, and that's also deflationary. In other words, money is being stolen. So there's less money around, that's deflationary. Why are they committing these frauds? Because there's no growth in their industry of banking to sustain their bonuses. So at the end of the year, they've got to go steal the bonuses. These people are engaged in embezzlement. Is it different than the embezzlement that Jamie Dimon was involved with at MF Global? Remember, he stole $1 billion ahead of the creditors in a completely illegal fashion. Then they retroactively went back and they changed the law and said, well, we were able to reverse the rotation of the planet Earth. And going backwards in time, we've decided he didn't break a law because those were laws that we were thinking about making at that time. We didn't get around to it, therefore he's innocent by virtue of time travel. That's his defense. And of course, this is what all the bankers do. I know myself, having worked on Wall Street, whenever you break the law, it's always the fact that, oh, you know what? It's not I didn't break the law, it's that the law hasn't been catching up to all my innovation as a financial engineer.
Now, finally, Max, you talked at the top of the show how it takes 1.39 liters of water to make a liter of water, or $18 of debt to create $1 of GDP growth. Now we see the opposite, the same sort of situation happening in the rest of the world. The internet has provided a great GDP, global GDP and efficiency and all sorts of productivity gains. But now we're seeing the breakup of it. And countries like Brazil are going to spend enormous amounts to create an alternate internet, essentially. They're going to basically spend 75 cents to keep the US from stealing $1's worth of corporate secrets. NSA surveillance may cause breakup of internet, warns experts. Internet specialists highlight moves by Brazil, Germany, and India towards creating separate networks in order to block spying. And they speak to some experts, Ian Brown from Oxford Institute, and he says that states may have few other options than to follow in Brazil's path. This would be expensive and likely reduce the rapid rate of innovation that has driven the development of the internet to date. But if states cannot trust that their citizens' personal data, as well as sensitive commercial and government information, will not otherwise be swept up by giant surveillance operations, that may be a price they are willing to pay.
And of course, Brazil's finance minister coined the phrase currency war. And as Jim Rickard says, first you have currency war, then you have trade war, then you have a hot war. Same thing happened pre-World War I, pre-World War II, hello, World War III. Stacy Herbert, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
Stay tuned for the second half, a whole lot more. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to go to Los Angeles and speak with Wolf Richter of TestosteronePit.com. Wolf, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
Hello, Max. Thanks for having me. I love being on your show.
All right, Wolf Richter, how is the Federal Reserve like dancing chickens?
Well, that story goes back to a movie called Pure Country, where two characters, the main character Dusty and his buddy, were talking, and so Buddy was telling the story about a guy whose thing was to get chickens to dance at a carnival, and come to find out he had one hand on the stage and the other hand on the burner, and heating up the stage, and when the feet got so hot that they couldn't stand it anymore, they started dancing.
Yeah, I remember back in Times Square, back in the 1970s, they used to have dancing chickens in the outside on the street in these little kiosks, and it worked on an electric hot plate. You put in a quarter, and the electricity would go through into the feet of the chicken, and they would start dancing. But you're saying that the dancing chicken syndrome applies to the Federal Reserve Bank. I assume what you're saying is that they just got to keep feeding it more quarters. They got to keep printing more money. They got to keep this chicken dancing.
That's right. And the thing is, actually, the Fed's turning on the heat underneath the chicken, and so the issue with the chickens is they don't jump off the stage. They're not smart enough to jump off the stage. So, and Ben Bernanke is counting on it that we're not jumping off that stage. And of course, the advice is if your feet get too hot, jump off the stage, do something different. And so Ben Bernanke, with his ZERP policies and his full effort to reduce interest rates long and short term to near zero, has made life very miserable for a lot of people that depend on it. that depend on yield income for many life insurance companies and other organizations, pension funds, Social Security, and continues to do so, and nobody's jumping off the stage.
Okay, so this is actually, to keep on the zoological theme here, a variation on the frog in the boiled water theme, where they keep turning up the heat, but the frog doesn't jump and he boils himself to death. That's another variation. So the Fed policies are essentially killing us. Now, Zero Hedge estimates that central banks around the world have created 18 trillion in debt since the Lehman collapse, but managed to generate only 1 trillion in GDP growth. This is the most lopsided debt to GDP growth number I've ever seen in any economy ever in history. Your thoughts?
Well, that is certainly true, and it's a big issue. There are two elements, there are really three elements in it. On the consumer side, consumers have actually marginally reduced the debt just a tiny bit, but governments and corporations have dramatically increased their debt. And in terms of corporations, obviously they haven't done anything productive with them. They're buying back shares. They're paying dividends. The share buybacks pay mostly for the shares that they have issued recently to acquire other companies, and pay corporate and pay executive benefit plans. And so it doesn't go, that corporate debt didn't go into building factories or plants or infrastructure. It went into Wall Street engineering, and it didn't produce any results, as we can see. And on the government side, they have obviously borrowed a huge amount of money, but as we have seen in Japan, for example, the biggest borrower of them all, they've had a very lackadaisical economy for many, many years, and they have essentially borrowed 40 to 50% of their entire budget expenditures every year. And it's the most gigantic stimulus package ever in the economy. It just hasn't really grown.
Yeah,
so
there was a great editorial in this week's Financial Times that said that until you downsize the financial sector, you won't get any GDP growth, because the too big to fail banks in the United Kingdom and the United States, they're just zombie banks, are gobbling up all this money, and they're retarding growth. They're keeping a lid on growth, and until you get rid of them, you won't have any growth. Now, the NSA spying scandal, when it emerged, it was revealed that national spy agency across the world are actually spying on behalf of the NSA. Is this the same case for central banks? Are the Bank of England and the ECB working, in effect, for the Fed? Wolf.
Well, that's an excellent question. I wish I were sitting on the Fed someplace to know the true answer. But one thing we know for sure, who the Fed is working for. The Fed is working for the companies that own it. And the Federal Reserve System in the United States is owned by private companies, and they run it. And so the Fed will do what's best for these companies. And that includes Goldman Sachs and all the big banks around the country, and some institutions like General Electric and others, formerly also Enron. So whether the other central banks work for the Fed, I'm not sure, but they're all working together. That's for certain.
Well, look at this situation. Let me point out something here, because in the United States, they just went through a whole big wrangle on raising the debt ceiling, and now they go through the same thing in a few weeks' time. They want to raise it up 17 trillion and beyond. Simultaneously, Mark Carney, the new chair at the Bank of England, said that he's going to expand the Bank of England's balance sheet from something around 4 trillion pounds to 9 trillion pounds. So isn't it obvious then that this whole debt ceiling debate in the United States, the off draft is going to be dumped into the Bank of England? The Bank of England is now going to be a toxic waste risk dump, and one of the primary beneficiaries of that will be the Federal Reserve Bank in America, which, if they have trouble getting through that debt ceiling, they're just going to dump the debt on the Bank of England's balance sheet. And of course, the Bank of England and the UK is the worst regulatory environment in the world, where most of the financial fraud and financial terrorism takes place. So don't we see, though, an exact correlation between debt ceiling, Bank of England, total collusion? These bankers are completely working for themselves, have nothing to do with generating GDP. It's a complete fraud. Your thoughts?
I totally agree. I mean, they're colluding hand in glove. If one central bank ever stops printing money and buying crappy bonds, another will pick up the pace. And right now, of course, the Fed's still buying and printing. The Bank of Japan has jumped in big time. The ECB has backed off just a little bit, and the Bank of England is now contemplating further expansions there. So, yeah, I mean, it's if one central bank just slows down a little bit, the other one will pick up the pace. So they are colluding. They're all sitting together in conferences. The Bank of International Settlement on its board, all the major central bankers. So they're definitely colluding on these issues.
I would imagine if I'm looking at this in terms of connecting the dots between the fraud between these central banks, my guess is that the next economy to have a massive social unrest problem will be the United Kingdom, and Mark Carney will be forced to climb down from this $9 trillion debt assumption that he's put forward into the public domain when there's blood in the streets. And then that debt, which would have been on the Bank of England's balance sheet, will be parked somewhere else. And as you point out at the top of the show, it's the dancing chicken syndrome or the boiled frog syndrome. The public's being lulled into a state of perpetual surveillance and martial law by the central banks to hide debt. My question to you is, what do you think about my guess that the next outbreak of blood in the streets for bankers will be in the United Kingdom? Your thoughts?
Well, I hope not. I don't want to see blood in the streets anywhere. Right now, we are seeing blood in the streets in France.
But wait a minute, Wolf. I must interject here, because The Economist magazine last year ran something called the Social Cohesion Index, which is an attempt to figure out where the social unrest, where the blood in the street will happen next. So these bankers are banking on blood in the streets. They've got contracts based on blood in the streets. Their entire raison d'etre is based on creating blood in the streets. So why should we not be in the game of trying to second guess where they next will attack? What's the big deal? They want the blood in the streets. They profit from the blood in the streets. So why are we so hesitant about calling them out on it? They want the blood in the streets right here in the UK because they profit from it. So let's be honest about it. Let's be honest, Wolf. Why are we hesitating from honesty? Wolf, your thoughts?
Oh, Max, I hate to predict the future like that, and I can definitely see blood in the streets. We're seeing blood in the streets right now, and it could very well be in the UK. The UK is more dependent on finance than any other major country. So if there's a big problem there, and it's likely that there will be, I can see it.
All right, Wolf, let's talk about the economic fallout from the NSA spying. The EU has put a halt to the latest trade pact with the U.S. China has halted purchases of U.S. tech products. What sort of losses are we looking at for the U.S. economy as a whole as a result of these NSA spying revelations from Snowden?
In the tech sector, I think there will be major repercussions. And IBM, for example, already announced that sales of hardware in China have collapsed by 50% last quarter. So there are real issues. We already know in the United States that Chinese manufacturer Huawei of telecom equipment has been banned. They can't sell telecom equipment in the U.S. simply because of their spying equipment built into their systems. So the question is, what are companies and governments going to buy to run their infrastructure? And they have to buy somewhere. So if they don't buy from IBM, who else are they going to buy from? There's Chinese manufacturers, the European manufacturers. The question is, who can produce what these American companies are producing? And some of them have competition overseas and some of them don't. So Oracle has competition overseas. Apple has competition overseas. Some other companies may not. Microsoft, with its Windows software system, has a backdoor in it that communicates with the NSA. But what other options do you have if you're a corporation?
Yeah, but Wolf, isn't the obvious option to go to open source? This is why you have companies like Red Hat, which is based on the open source technology from Linux, which took the internet by storm a few years ago. It's now running most of the backbone of the internet. Why doesn't China just say, we don't want proprietary code from IBM anymore. It's full of bugs and full of Warren Buffett coercion-style banking terrorism. We're just going to create open source technology. Why not? Why don't these countries just go open source?
And they're doing that. The problem there is that Linux too has a backdoor. NSA has designed the security kernel for that program many years ago, and it was incorporated. The advantage of Linux is that it's not hidden, that you can see the code. So if you're an expert programmer, you can see it and you can deal with it. Now, IBM is selling Linux servers, and they're in partnership with Red Hat, and they're selling Linux servers. But those have crashed too in the sales of them.
Okay,
and,
well, that's a very important point, Wolf, is that even Linux has a backdoor with the NSA, but it does have some transparency attached to it. That's a very interesting point. Listen, Wolf Richter, we're out of time. We'll have to have you on again soon. Thanks for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
And that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Wolf Richter of TestosteronePit.com. If you'd like to get in touch, tweet us at Keiser Report. Until next time, Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.